today's episode, Dr. Plotkin will discuss one of the most well-known plants of the gods, marijuana. From the first ancient marijuana parties in Eurasia to the Reefer Madness hysteria in the U.S., Dr. Plotkin will explore the origins and importance of marijuana through a series of captivating and often unexpected stories throughout history.
I want to welcome everyone back to the second season of Plants of the Gods. We have an incredible lineup this season, visiting, listening, learning, exploring the impact of these plants, these fungi, and these animal substances on our healing, on our culture, on our history, and on our future. In today's episode, we're going to look into the most used and consumed of the plants of the gods, marijuana. We're going to talk about the origins and evolution of marijuana, the earliest uses of cannabis around the world, the role of marijuana in the American Cultural Revolution of the 60s and 70s, as well as the modern-day medical perspective on this revered plant of the gods. So ubiquitous has cannabis become right here in the United States of America that we calculate there's over 1,000 slang terms for it. And in this age of cannabis breeding and distribution and marketing, there's over 2,300 strains of marijuana alone. So what is cannabis? There's many forms of marijuana that we could touch on and define, but there's a couple of terms I want to start out with. Marijuana is basically any plant of the genus Cannabis, and it is also a psychoactive drug derived from this plant. There's about 3 species of marijuana, 2 of which, sativa and indica, supply us with the psychoactive substances we all know. Second term I want to define at the outset is hemp. Hemp is very simply a fiber derived from the cannabis plant. The third term is that of hashish. Hashish is something comprised of the flowering tops, leaves, and resin of cannabis that is smoked or consumed to induce altered states. I'm here today to start off the second season of Plants of the Gods to tell you, without question, that marijuana is as American as apple pie. We go to school to study Johnny Appleseed. We say an apple a day keeps the doctor away. We note that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. We talk on our Apple iPhone, read newspapers on our Apple iPad, and write podcast episodes on our Apple computers. In fact, Apple is considered the quintessential American company by people around the world. We visit the Big Apple, but we avoid the bad apples and we avoid the apple polishers. The apple is considered the ultimate American fruit, but there's one hitch. The apple did not originate in the U.S. In fact, the apple originates in the country of Kazakhstan in Eurasia. When most Americans think of Kazakhstan, if they think of Kazakhstan at all, they think of Borat and his subsequent movie film, but apples originally came from Kazakhstan. And there's yet another Eurasian plant that is equally American, and that is marijuana. The Puritans grew it, Thomas Jefferson grew it at Monticello, William Penn grew it in Pennsylvania, and George Washington grew it at Mount Vernon. In fact, if you visit his old farm here in Virginia, you can occasionally find marijuana growing there as a weed. In fact, it's widely reported that the first drafts of both the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, our founding documents, were both written on hemp paper, though the final versions we see today at the National Archives were written on parchment, which is sheepskin. It's clear that hemp paper from marijuana was the ubiquitous scrap paper of colonial America, and the westward-bound covered wagons like the Conestogas that conquered the West were often covered in cloth made from hemp. According to my colleague ethnobotanist Judith Sumner, the U.S. Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 was designed to curtail the use of marijuana as a drug and the growth of hemp for papermaking in favor of wood pulp. But given the need for fiber for ropes and sails for the war effort just a few years later in 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed emergency legislation to not only permit but to encourage farmers to grow hemp again. In fact, so urgent was the need for hemp that the government produced a film entitled Hemp for Victory. George Bush, the former president, served as a pilot in World War II. In one of the battles in the Pacific over an island known as Chichijima, south of Japan, his plane was hit and he bailed out. Little did Bush realize, Parts of his aircraft engine were lubricated with cannabis hemp seed oil. 100% of his parachute webbing was made from U.S.-grown cannabis hemp. The rigging and ropes of the ship that rescued him were made of cannabis. The fire hoses on the ship were woven from cannabis. And as he stood safely on the deck, his shoes stitching was made from hemp fiber as well. Ironically, Bush went on to be a crusader against cannabis during the drug war. Thus, in this one story, we see encapsulated America's love-hate history relationship with the cannabis plant. So where did cannabis come from, and how did it, in its various forms, become so quintessentially American? Cannabis is one of the first plants ever cultivated by the human species. More likely, it began more than 10,000 years ago. My mentor, Richard Schultes, the original author of the book Plants of the Gods, the inspiration for this podcast, always taught his students that cannabis is a 5-purpose plant. Cannabis is first and foremost used for fibers. In fact, the word cannabis is ancient Greek for made of hemp and is the origin of the English word canvas. Cannabis produces a useful oil. It is both highly nutritious and useful for industrial purposes. It produces edible seeds. It is important as a narcotic, and it's also useful and has long been used as a medicine. It can be difficult to figure out the actual origin and place of origin for many cultivated plants, which is why it's a little difficult to tease out the actual discovery and first cultivation of cannabis by the human species. This is true of any cultivated plant, whether you're talking about cannabis or whether you're talking about corn. Schultes himself put it very succinctly as the reason for this confusion. Quote, "Unusual things happen to plants after long association with man and agriculture. They're grown in new and strange environments and often have opportunities to hybridize that are not offered in their native habitat. They escape from cultivation and frequently become aggressive weeds. They may be changed through human selection for characteristics associated with a specific use. Many cultivated plants are so changed from their ancestral type that it is not possible to unravel their evolutionary history." In fact, Schultes himself did some of the most important early work on the taxonomy, that is the classification of cannabis, doing original field research on cannabis in its native habitat in Afghanistan in the early 70s. There's a marvelous picture of him happily ensconced next to a local tribesman and a cannabis plant in the Afghan desert near Kandahar in 1971. There's actually been a lot of uncertainty as to even which family cannabis belongs to. Today, most botanists classify it as part of its own special family, the so-called Cannabaceae. The only other genus in this family is Humulus, better known as hops. Hops are, of course, used in beer making. They're used to keep beer fresh, to retain a head of foam, and to impart its characteristic hoppy aroma and flavor. When you consider that cannabis and hops are classified in the same family, it sounds more like a college frat party than a botanical classification. Botanists have long disagreed as to actually how many species of cannabis exist, although most scientists today agree that there are 3 separate species: Cannabis indica, Cannabis ruderalis, and Cannabis sativa. The classification is based on differences in their growth habit, and in other words, whether the plant is a small weed or a woody bush. Also differences in the wood structure, as well as the characters of the so-called achenes. Here's a botanical side note. What we call cannabis seeds are scientifically known as achenes, Achenes. Achenes are small, dry, one-seeded fruits. They're highly nutritious and have been found in archaeological digs in Germany as far back as 500 BC. Today, they're most commonly used as an important component in birdseed, that is, bird food. Marijuana plants are dioecious, meaning there exist both male and female plants. Resin is produced by cells known as trichomes, with unfertilized female flowers and adjacent leaves featuring the most resin. While much of the marijuana sold today is leaves, stems, and female flowers, hashish is made primarily by compressing the trichomes and the actual resin itself. Let's take a look at how cannabis was used by early civilizations and how that changed over the course of history. Can you guess who we think the earliest users of cannabis were? Actually, it was the Chinese. And can you guess how they used it? Primarily as a fiber. Ethnobotanists believe that the history of the use of a particular plant usually proceeds from the simplest use to the more complex. Therefore, it is highly likely that cannabis was first used as a fiber, and we'll get into this in the next episode, the importance of cannabis hemp for the rise of civilization. Remains of hemp fibers have been found in some of the earliest archaeological digs in Asia. There's ample evidence of hemp fiber in China from 4000 BC and Turkestan from 3000 BC. The use of this plant for these fiber purposes, meaning everything from clothes to roofs to ropes to twine to sails, is undoubtedly very, very ancient. The historical record, however, shows that the Chinese used cannabis as more than just a fiber. The earliest medical data from China is attributed to the possibly legendary Emperor Shen Nung around 2000 BC. He created a list of various medicinal uses of cannabis, but also described it as a mind-altering plant. He wrote, quote, "If taken over the long term, it makes one communicate with spirits and lighten one's body." Sounds pretty shamanic to me. Other records from ancient China describe cannabis as both a giver of delights, but also as a, quote, liberator of sin. This is probably the first report of what we know as Reefer Madness, the belief that cannabis has a very negative effect on human behavior. The negative reputation of cannabis, particularly in the U.S. during the latter half of the 20th century, as well as earlier and elsewhere, can perhaps be traced back to this concept that cannabis may possibly be beneficial and therapeutic, but may also be bad and evil. Now, as I said, the records from early China indicate the use of cannabis primarily as a fiber, but recent finds of ancient mummies from thousands of years ago in Western China indicate that these people were using cannabis as a narcotic, and these tombs are still coming to light. In ancient India, the peoples used cannabis primarily for therapeutic and mind-altering purposes. Schultes himself wrote, "In Indian mythology, hemp was a gift to the gods. Its medicinal virtues lowered fevers, fostered sleep-relieved dysentery, and cured sundry other ills. It also stimulated the appetite, prolonged life, quickened the mind, and improved the judgment." In ancient India especially, the true medicinal use of cannabis was closely associated with its magico-religious functions. As in many cultures, narcotics or hallucinogens represented the medicines par excellence, assuming because of their psychoactive power a far more important role than the merely physically active medicines. After China, where do we find cannabis next in the historical record? The Holy Land. In 2011, the 4th century tomb near Jerusalem yielded the skeletal remains of a young woman who is believed to have died in childbirth. Cannabis remains were also found with the body, indicating that, in all likelihood, cannabis was being employed as a pain reliever. Even more surprising is a recent discovery in 2019. I think it was at Tel Arad, which is just 60 miles south of Tel Aviv. The remains of cannabis found burned on a temple altar dated to 700 BC. Now, this could cause us to rethink what we understand about the origins of Judaism and other Western religions. As I mentioned in an earlier episode on ergot, I talked about Brian Murarescu's book, The Immortality Key, and the use of hallucinogenic fungi and hallucinogenic plants like opium as a possible precursor of the Christian religion. The idea that cannabis and other plants of the gods may have played a role in most religions is just coming to the fore. My pal, the writer Michael Pollan, refers to this as, quote, the natural history of world religions. We've long known that cannabis was used medicinally in the Holy Land, but to find it in a temple near Jerusalem, to find it on an altar, to find it being burned in said temple, indicates more than a medicinal use. Undoubtedly, further archaeological research will yield more light on that which remains a mystery. Where did we learn about cannabis after the Holy Land? Eurasia, amongst the nomadic Scythian horsemen. Around 500 BC, the Greek writer Herodotus, who's widely known as the father of history, gave a great account of the Scythians and their involvement with marijuana. These were the nomadic horsemen of Central Asia, coming out of Crimea and other places to conquer much of the known world. I mentioned them in an earlier episode because of their famous curare, arrow poison, they used as they gallop across the plains of Europe and elsewhere. Herodotus wrote that the Scythians construct a tent by fixing sticks in the ground and then covering them with wooden pelts. According to Herodotus, quote, inside the tent, a dish is then placed upon the ground, into which they put a number of red-hot stones and then add some marijuana. Immediately it gives out a smoke and a vapor, and the Scyths delight and shout with joy. Certainly some of Herodotus' claims are difficult to verify, but excavations in the 20th century of Scythian tombs found pots of coals filled with the charred remains of cannabis. Clearly, Herodotus was telling the truth, and equally clearly, the Scythians were having some of the first pot parties ever recorded.
To purchase Dr. Mark Plotkin's new book, The Amazon, What Everyone Needs to Know, or his first book, Tales of a Shaman's Apprentice, visit your local bookseller or order from Amazon.com.
So let's take a look at marijuana amongst the ancient Greeks and the Romans, who may just have created the first base cakes and magic brownies. Marijuana was certainly not a major plant in the ethnopharmacopoeia of the Greeks and Romans. Cannabis did not occupy a central role in their culture, much as the wine grape did, as we discussed in the episode on the ethnobotany of wine. The ancient Greek writer Democritus reported that marijuana was occasionally drunk with wine and myrrh to produce visionary states, delirium, and, quote, immoderate laughter. In fact, Democritus himself was known to some as the laughing philosopher. He's also believed to have helped devise some of the first theories on atoms and atomic structure. Could cannabis have helped inspire this creativity on his part? In our previous episode on wine, we also talked about Galen, a Greek physician in the Roman Empire. Galen reported that wealthy Romans would sometimes drink wine mixed with cannabis at the end of a banquet to produce, quote, warmth and excited pleasure. He also noted that these feasts sometimes featured cakes of hemp, which, if eaten to excess, were totally intoxicating. This is clearly the first historical report of magic brownies. If we look to the ancient Middle East, we find the early use of a new and different form of cannabis, hashish. In the 11th century, a Persian by the name of Al-Hasan ibn al-Sabah built a castle overlooking the caravan route from the Caspian shores to Baghdad. In fact, the remains of the castle still stand. He and his band of followers lived by plundering the riches of these passing caravans. His men were known as the Hashishin, named after him, Hassan, and they were compensated not only with the riches that they stole, but they were surrounded in the castle by famously beautiful gardens and plied with a beverage made from cannabis, although the famous biochemist John Mann believes that other drugs like opium were part of the recipe. Because part of their payment was this hallucinogenic brew, which featured hashish, his gang members were known as the Assassins, which is a corruption of hashishin. Many historians have reported that these bandits were given hashish to excite them to a fever pitch, during which they would sally out and attack the caravans. But anyone who has experienced marijuana or hashish, maybe even some of the listeners of this podcast, know that violence is the last thing on their mind in this altered states. So how did marijuana and hashish make their way to Western Europe? Well, with the help of Napoleon and his army. As my fellow botanist Beryl Simpson has written, cannabis is native to Central Asia, but the seeds can be dispersed by water, wind, birds, and mammals, so cannabis has a habit of moving far beyond where it's planted. For the purpose of this podcast, we're primarily interested in the cultural aspects of how it was moved around and the cultural and medical impact that it had. In 1800, Napoleon invaded Egypt. Remember, this was a French army, and French people liked their wine. There was not much wine in the Egyptian desert. As we've seen over and over again in the course of this podcast, human nature seeks altered states. So what is a French army stranded and fighting in the Egyptian desert going to consume to alter their reality? The answer is hashish, much more common in Egypt than French wine. The French became accustomed to eating and smoking hashish, and when Napoleon and his soldiers returned to France, they brought the custom and the hash with them. Hashish was then studied by French physicians, particularly for the treatment of mental illness. And then a group of artists and intellectuals in Paris decided they would begin to experiment with it, because as we've seen, people are always looking for new means of enhancing their creativity. In honor of the Assassins, the original Hashishins, these French artists formed what they called the Club de Hashish. This included such notable French authors and artists as Baudelaire, Victor Hugo, and Alexandre Dumas. Dumas went on to write some of the most famous books of all time, and if you read The Count of Monte Cristo, in my opinion his greatest book, you see that hashish figures in the course of the plot. Now you know where he got the idea. These fellows met at the Hotel Puymaudan in the Ile Saint-Louis, which is still there if you visit Paris, and word got out that these French artists were experimenting with these mind-altering substances. British artists then decided to give it a try. Soon people like Oscar Wilde and the poet Yeats began to experiment with it as well. From there, let's take a step into our own lifetimes. We're all familiar with cannabis and its many uses, nicknames, reputation, political implications, etc. Some of you may even have experienced it firsthand. When I was a kid growing up in New Orleans in the 70s, people smoked a very low grade of marijuana. This was cannabis sativa, leaves, stems, and even seeds sometimes. There's a great Commander Cody song about this, the Down to Seeds and Stems Again blues. Hashish, much more powerful, was something we could only dream of. But there was talk of the magic bus, also known as the bus that traveled the hippie trail. These were typically cheap VW buses that would drive from Europe all the way to South Asia overland in search of enlightenment and especially the exceedingly potent cannabis indica, then often called Thai stick. Many made that trek, often inspired by the Beatles' interest in Eastern religion, by transcendental meditation, by the quest for altered states, and the restlessness of youth in general. But with the revolution in Iran and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, these treks became increasingly dangerous and less appealing. Yet again, though, it was that search for these mind-altering substances, that search for a plant of the gods, that drove people from very comfortable homes in the West to jump on these buses through high mountain passes, through wild areas in search of the ultimate high. As much as marijuana has captured the American imagination and made a place for itself in the hearts, minds, lungs, stomachs, brownies, and brains, and onto the shelves of medical dispensaries of Americans, the history of cannabis is certainly not all just flower power hippies and nonviolent protest. Unfortunately, this old story of the assassins was seized upon by U.S. government officials as one of the reasons for banning marijuana in the latter half of the 20th century. This is what became known as Reefer Madness, named after a 1936 American propaganda film funded by a church group which claimed that marijuana and hashish foster violence and killing. The idea that marijuana automatically turns people into crazed killing machines is ridiculous. As I would say, give guys unlimited alcohol and they'll drive down the highway at 120 miles an hour. Give guys unlimited hashish and they'll tear down the highway at 15 miles an hour. Another adage says, give 4 guys unlimited alcohol and they'll start a brawl, but give 4 guys lots of marijuana and they'll start a band. In a later episode, I want to talk about how this whole reefer madness mania has fomented racism in America. On the ACLU website, it points out that despite roughly equal usage rates, African Americans are almost 4 times more likely than whites to be arrested for marijuana possession. Police routinely arrest millions of people just for having marijuana every year. Billions of taxpayer dollars fund these arrests, which disproportionately target black people. Let's take a step beyond the cultural and social side of marijuana and dive a bit into the chemistry, which is extremely complicated. To talk about the chemistry of marijuana, we need to talk about THC. The chemistry of the plant is fiendishly complex, and it wasn't until 1964 that even the active compound, which is THC, was first identified. This led to a new and better understanding of how it worked in the human body, but one challenge remained: where exactly it attached. This is a bit of a biochemical concept which is very important, the idea of receptors. Let me explain what a receptor is, extracted from my book Medicine Quest, published in 2000. Quote, all drugs have a target in the body, which is a site of action. Many of these targets are receptors, protein molecules on the cell surface that interact with other molecules. The receptor is often described as the lock into which the key molecules must fit. Drugs can either fit into the receptors and elicit a certain response, in which case they are known as agonists, or they can block the receptors, eliciting no response, but keeping other chemical messengers from interacting with the receptors. These are known as antagonists." End of quote. As recently as a few decades ago, we knew what the active principle was in marijuana, but we didn't know how it worked in the brain. However, in the late 1980s, many regions of the brain were found to contain cannabinoid receptors, that is, where the THC attached. Of course, the next question was, why would the human brain evolve to receive marijuana molecules? This led to further research and finding a molecule in the human body that attaches itself to these receptors. The seminal research on this issue was done by an Israeli-Bulgarian Jew by the name of Raphael Mechulam, who was born in Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria, in 1930. He attended the American grade school for 4 years until it was closed by the pro-German government with the advent of the Nazis. Although his father was dragged off to a concentration camp, which he ultimately survived, the child managed to escape the Nazis' clutches by moving throughout tiny villages in rural Bulgaria with his mother until the end of the war. After the war, they moved to Israel, where he became a famous and internationally recognized chemist. It was this refugee, this immigrant, who unlocked many of the secrets of how marijuana worked in the human brain, in the human body. At this point in time, in the year 2021, cannabis is the most widely used, widely distributed, and widely cultivated plants of the gods on planet Earth. Remember that most mind-altering plants have active compounds containing nitrogen. These are the so-called alkaloids that we've talked about in the past. However, the active component in marijuana is THC, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol if you're a chemist. There are more than 30 other similar compounds in marijuana known as cannabinoids. These compounds act on the central nervous system, causing changes in perceptions of time, touch, and taste. Smoking or consuming the drug usually causes happiness, delight, hunger, and thirst, although ingestion of large amounts can also cause anxiety and paranoia. Perhaps the single best description of this sense of euphoria and calmness is attributed to the writer Walter Bromberg. He wrote, quote, "Within a few minutes, the smoker begins to feel more calm and soon develops definite euphoria. He becomes talkative, he's elated and exhilarated. He begins to have an astounding feeling of lightness of the limbs and body. He laughs uncontrollably and explosively without, at times, the slightest provocation. He has the impression that his conversation is witty and brilliant." End of quote. It's important to point out that these studies of cannabis and cannabinoid receptors in the brain and in the body have led to a better understanding of the brain and the body. The point here is that these plants of the gods are not only important for their own sake and the feelings they induce, but also what they can teach us about ourselves. The research on cannabis and the cannabinoid receptors has opened new doors of understanding about the human body, the human mind, and the human nervous system. Western medicine's growing appreciation for the many therapeutic values of cannabis has led to its widespread use to treat nausea and the lack of appetite due to cancer chemotherapy, as well as ailments as diverse as Crohn's disease, epileptic seizures, and chronic pain. Today, there was a report of the cannabinoids offering new hope in the understanding and treatment of Alzheimer's. As cannabis becomes more a part of the medical mainstream, there'll be more uses, wonderful uses, miraculous applications of this wonderful plant and its incredible healing powers. To finish today's episode, I want to tell you about a crusading Harvard scientist and how he rescued an embattled beetle. Dr. Lester Grinspoon was a respected psychiatrist at Harvard Medical School, where he was an authority on schizophrenia. He had just completed a major study of schizophrenia and had some spare time on his hands. At the time, marijuana was sweeping through the Harvard campus, and Grinspoon, like most adults at the time, had been led to believe that marijuana was both harmful and addictive. So he did a deep dive into the literature, much of which had to do with studies of people on the long-term effects of marijuana in British India. He was quite stunned to learn that marijuana indeed was not harmful, marijuana was not addictive, and that it had many therapeutic benefits as well. In fact, Grinspoon and my mentor, Richard Schultes, took great pleasure in being called to court as expert witnesses and setting free kids who'd been busted for having a joint in their possession. What Schultes would do would be to tell the defending attorney to ask the prosecution whether or not the joint consisted of cannabis sativa. As I said earlier, there are 3 species of cannabis: cannabis sativa, cannabis indica, and cannabis ruderalis. At the time, the law only prohibited the use of cannabis sativa. So if some poor Boston policeman couldn't prove that this was cannabis sativa versus cannabis indica, which of course he could never do, the kids would go free. Grinspoon, on the other hand, as a psychiatrist, took a different tack. He was testifying to the fact that despite all of his studies, he was convinced that marijuana used in moderate doses, used correctly, was not dangerous, not addictive, and quite often therapeutic. Grinspoon, up to this point, had never smoked a joint because it was illegal. Many times, prosecuting attorneys would try to trap him by asking him if he had smoked a joint, if he'd smoked marijuana. He would always reply, "No, I have not." At one point, somebody tried to catch him by asking, quote, "How can you be an expert on marijuana if you've never even tried it?" Grinspoon replied, "Well, I'm an expert on schizophrenia, and I haven't experienced that so far either." Finally, Grinspoon decided he should really try it so he could speak more authoritatively on the issue. The famous astronomer Carl Sagan, who was a friend of his, offered him a joint at a party in Cambridge. Grinspoon smoked it, and nothing happened. Then he tried it on another occasion. Nothing happened. Then he decided to do something different. His kids loved rock and roll, so the next time he smoked a joint, he played Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and that did it. He got very, very high. Ironically, it was soon after that he was called as an expert witness in perhaps the most infamous prosecution of the Nixon administration. Nixon famously called John Lennon the most dangerous man in America. They busted Lennon and tried to deport him based on a prior marijuana conviction in the UK. Grinspoon rose to Lennon's defense. The case was thrown out of court, Lennon was free, and Grinspoon saved the day. Today, his son Peter continues at Harvard Medical School and continues to speak out on the value of therapeutic compounds and plants like cannabis. Stay tuned for our follow-up episode on one of the most important forms of cannabis, hemp fiber. Hemp was a staple of the ancient Greek and Roman empires, and this use by Western civilization only expanded over time. The maritime supremacy of England during the Elizabethan era only increased the demand. Hemp cultivation began in the British colonies in the New World quite early, first in Canada in 1606, then in Virginia in 1611. The Pilgrims took the crop to New England in 1632, and in pre-revolutionary North America, it was employed for making clothes, rope, twine, sails for boats, and many other purposes. Hemp fiber helped build this country, and we'll talk more about that in the next episode of Plants of the Gods.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please remember to subscribe and share. We appreciate your support for the protection of the knowledge and biodiversity of Indigenous peoples and ancestral territories. In our next episode, Dr. Plotkin will discuss hemp fiber and its impactful role in shaping human history. Here's a quick preview from our upcoming episode.
In 1938, Popular Mechanics ran an article where it touted hemp as the next billion-dollar crop, claiming that it could be used to produce more than 25,000 different products ranging from dynamite to cellophane. As recently as 2015, this idea that hemp would be a billion-dollar crop was being dismissed. Today, it's become a reality. It's considered the paragon of the eco-friendly crop because it requires neither irrigation nor pesticide application in most cases, particularly as opposed to cotton, which requires plenty of both. Today, such top-flight fashion designers as Calvin Klein and Giorgio Armani are selling hemp clothing and bed linens at premium prices.